Okay, let's get started. Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is Rosalind Segara, and I'm the Neighborhood Outreach Manager for the Los Angeles Conservancy. I will serve as the moderator for today's program, People and Places, A New Future Blooms for Historic Tokyo Florist. This program is part of the Conservancy's People and Places virtual programming series, which celebrates the people and places that make LA unique. Thank you to our community sponsors listed here who have helped us promote the event. Thank you also to our members who support preserving historic places like Tokio Florist. If you aren't yet a member, please consider joining to help support programs and projects like these. Today's program focuses on Historic Cultural Monument 1198, the Sakai-Kozawa Residence / Tokio Florist and pole sign located on a commercial corridor in the Silver Lake neighborhood. We will learn more about the site's rich history, the community effort to designate and memorialize the site, and the vision for the site's continued use. In 2018, the Conservancy was approached by two local residents with an idea to collaborate on a landmark nomination for the Tokio Florist property, which was put on the market by its longtime owners, the Sakai-Kozawa family. The Conservancy helped prepare and supported the nomination through the designation process. Most recently, we have been in conversation with the new ownership team and advocates about the future of the unpermitted structures on the property. You might have noticed that your cameras are off, but that doesn't mean that you can't participate in today's event. Please enter any comments you have in the chat box and any questions that you have for the panelists in the Q&A box. We will get to those in the second half of the event. I'm very excited to welcome and introduce our special guests now. Kristen Hayashi co-authored the Tokio Florist Landmark nomination. She is the Director of Collections and Curator at the Japanese American National Museum, is a board member of the Little Tokyo Historical Society, and a board member of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. Catherine Gudis is Professor of History and Director of the Public History Program at UC Riverside. Kathy is a longtime resident of Silver Lake and was a customer at the Tokio Florist. She also co-authored the Tokio Florist Landmark nomination. Michael Breland and Peter Harper are principals with Breland-Harper, a design and development firm based in Los Angeles. They are the lead designers in the adaptive reuse of the Tokio Florist site, which is now owned by Redcar Properties. The first part of the program will include brief presentations by our special guests, and I'll be back in the second half to moderate the Q&A. So Kristen, let's get started.
Okay, thanks Rosalind, to you and your colleagues at the LA Conservancy for including us in this series, People and Places. Centering people in the preservation of place is central to our work as public historians and certainly applicable to the former Tokio Florist site. So I'd like to introduce you to the Sakai-Kozawa family and share the story of their longtime business, Tokio Florist. The Sakai-Kozawa family lived and operated their cut flower business known as Tokio Florist at 2718 Hyperion Avenue in Silver Lake from the early 1960s to 2006. The property is unique in its ability to anchor many themes that are integral to the region's identity. Tokio Florist is a touchstone to a time when flower fields blanketed significant portions of the Los Angeles basin. It's representative of contributions that Japanese Americans made to Southern California's floriculture. And it also underscores the entrepreneurial might of small family businesses, especially those that were operated by women of color. The story of Tokio Florist began in 1929 when recently widowed Yuki Sakai, with 5 young children to support, opened a flower shop on Los Feliz Boulevard, which she called Tokio Florist. It was one of many flower farms and nurseries operated by Japanese immigrants in this area. Operating Tokio Florist came against great odds, though. Barred from naturalization, Japanese immigrants like Yuki had to find creative ways around discriminatory legislation, such as the Alien Land Law, which placed stringent restrictions on land usage and ownership. Although Tokio Florist opened just ahead of the Depression, it managed to maintain steady business. Every member of the family helped with daily operations, cultivating flowers and keeping the store open 7 days a week. Soon, though, the forced removal and incarceration of West Coast residents of Japanese descent during World War II meant that the Sakai family had to quickly settle their business and personal affairs. The Sakais made an arrangement with a neighbor to take care of Tokio Florist. Following the family's return from Manzanar after the war, it took several years, but the family was able to revive the flower shop. By 1960, though, Tokio Florist and other nearby small businesses were displaced as apartment towers began to spring up on Los Feliz Boulevard. The real estate market held greater value for residential development than flower cultivation. Additionally, many mom and pop flower shops were forced out of business over the next couple of decades as supermarkets and corporate chains generated fierce competition. It was the beginning of the end of the Japanese American flower farms and stands that once dotted the area, but not for Tokio Florist, which would reopen less than a mile away on Hyperion Avenue in Silver Lake. At their new location, Yuki, along with her daughter Sumi and son-in-law Frank Kozawa, constructed a greenhouse, converted a garage into a workshop, and reinstalled a large workbench and other equipment under the porte cochere and the porch of their new home to facilitate operations of Tokio Florist. These structures reflect the family's efforts to ensure that the business would be viable after they struggled for so many years to revive it following World War II. The loyal customers who had frequented the flower shop for decades allowed Tokio Florist to flourish in this new location. Those loyal customers enjoyed the novelty of experiencing the property, a bonus that came with their flower arrangement purchase. So now I invite you to use your imagination as I describe the flow you would have experienced as a customer. So as you drove along Hyperion Avenue, the large Tokio Florist sign marking where you should turn in would be the first thing that you would have seen. You would have driven onto the property, walked up the long driveway where you'd get a glimpse of the Tudor craftsman house where the family lived. As you proceeded further under the porte cochere, you might take a peek in the large refrigerated display case, or you might have chatted with Sumi in her workshop or studio where she created her floral arrangements. This open workshop would have been filled with vibrant flower arrangements, verdant plants, funeral sprays in progress, soda can mobiles hanging overhead, barrelware pots on display, and likely stems and all kinds of other organic materials strewn all over the ground while the artist was at work. I should point out that these are stills from Giovanni Jance's film on Tokio Florist, and the images that I'm showing you are sort of a mix of recent shots as well as photos from when Tokio Florist was in operation. So perhaps Iceland poppies growing off in the distance would have caught your eye, causing you to wander out and notice the greenhouse, which would have contained potted plants available for purchase. Then up ahead on the terrace landscape, you might have spotted Sumi's husband, Frank, bent over to pick Iceland poppies, sweet peas, and seasonal flowers, cigar visible out of the corner of his mouth. Perhaps you would have continued walking around the house, ending up in the Japanese garden that Frank and Sumi designed. Or you might have retraced your steps back out to the front where you would have made your selections and walked up the stairs onto the porch. Here, you would have been able to peruse more plants and flower arrangements before making your final transaction at the register. This multi-generational, women-run business thrived until 2006 when Sumi retired at the age of 90. She passed away 10 years later in 2016. Together, the architecture of these vernacular structures surrounding the Kozawa family's home helped to illustrate the character of Tokio Florist. And while the plants, tools, and family members no longer occupy these spaces, these empty structures continue to read as a Japanese American operated cut flower shop, which is now such a rarity in Los Angeles. In 2018, our friend and colleague Sojin Kim introduced a group of us preservationists, historians, and museum professionals to the story of Tokio Florist. Rosalind, Kathy, and I, representing the LA Conservancy, Japanese American National Museum, Little Tokyo Historical Society, UC Riverside, and Silver Lake residents felt that a historic cultural monument designation was fitting as a way to reckon with long histories of racism and reinscribe the contributions of Japanese Americans and women onto the landscape of Los Angeles. We also intended to increase the representation among the HCMs for Japanese Americans and women of color. At the same time, the Kozawa family was beginning the process to sell the property, and because the future ownership was unknown, we quickly mobilized to research and write the Historic Cultural Monument nomination. A year later, with a lot of community support, the Sakai-Kozawa Residence / Tokio Florist and pole sign became City of Los Angeles HCM number 1198. The Historic Cultural Monument nomination was just one way that we've preserved the history and memory of Tokio Florist and the Sakai-Kozawa family, and this preservation work continues today. Additionally, a great deal has transpired in terms of plans for the site, so I'll now turn it over to my fellow panelists to elaborate.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I'm going to try and just pick up on where Kristen left off. If we this story doesn't end with its the property's nomination. As Kristen said, the designation of the property as a City of LA Historic Cultural Monument is incredibly important as it addresses erasures and silences in the dominant record and revises what have been quite selective traditions of landmark nominations that have long emphasized architectural connoisseurship and celebrated especially white elite and men. Now, at all steps of this landmarking process, there was an outpouring of community response and support. And this was also the case after the purchase of the property by its new owners, Red Car developers, who faced really big challenges and great potential of adaptively reusing the home, shop, and flower growing areas for other purposes. Especially challenging is that these vernacular architectural elements, which you're looking at in these slides, which refers to additions that were made by the family, by non-architects, and likely by Frank with his the cigar hanging out of the side of his mouth, as was usually the case. These were largely unpermitted and constructed out of necessity and with commonplace materials. Yet these are the structures that for many community stakeholders represent what makes the site Tokio Florist rather than just another pretty and lovely historic Tudor craftsman house. And so these are just some of the additions to the property that Kristen also walked you through and that you'll see again in the next presentation. And so the approval by the City Council of the property as monument surely doesn't mark the end of the story for Tokio Florist. And really, with the change in the ownership of the property to the new owner, you might think of it as, that part of the animus or the spirit that animates the buildings, the land, and other spaces with the stories and people who have invested it with meaning, that all of that will also change, which is a positive thing, right? But how do we honor what's imbued the site, not only with character-defining structures, but also meaning? How to also allow new stories and uses is implicit in the process of adaptive reuse. And what characterizes this as a worthwhile case study for connecting people and place. Now, I want to just, really offer some kudos or congratulations to the Office of Historic Resources, Cultural Heritage Commission, and especially Red Car for acknowledging the fact that these structures that really, by many reckonings, need to be replaced, right? For understanding our concern about it and for convening subcommittees that met to tour the site, tour these structures to understand their essential characters, which again, you'll hear more about later. And so what I think this also suggests when we look at these sets of processes is that we also have a need, a necessity really, to demonumentalize preservation in some ways, to say it's not just about that really beautiful building, but also the hand of these other makers, and to revise that emphasis on heroism and the spectacle of events as drivers of historical change. What about lives that are lived in spaces of precarity or daily, lifelong, usually unacknowledged labor? right? Difficulty, how do we represent that among buildings and structures and landscapes? This is typically invisible. It's distinctly not considered monumental. And perhaps that's why labor and laboring landscapes seem very scantily attended to among historic cultural monuments too. We see leaders of industry and their buildings commemorated, but not usually the multiple groups of laborers on whose back industry was built, the places where they lived or the fields where they grew and picked flowers and crops. And I think we're in an especially important moment with discussion of monuments and their toppling in recent years to rethink the role of preservation in terms of this and to call for something else, in short. If we're really going to connect people to place, we have to care about a broader range of people, as Kristen also suggested. And the Tokio Florist also indicates preservation as important because it's an ongoing process or continuum, and that it enables us to consider sites of struggle, possibility, and memory as part of a broader reckoning. And so I think that what we want to look at, and what I want to show in these last few slides for this segment, is the way in which preservation work in other forms, on-site and off, remains ongoing and really crucial to the larger project of rethinking preservation as a form of memory work that can serve a productive role, including a role in reckoning with the past and past injustices. For instance, Susie Kozawa, who you see on the right with documentarian Brigitte Kelly, who is the granddaughter of Susie, the granddaughter of Tokio Florist founder, is a sound artist based in Seattle. And she took on legacy building as a means of both processing the past and creating something new. And she described her own process of sort of leaving the property, which was her lifelong home and this long-term business, through the three-part process: documentation, dissemination, and creative reuse. And all three blur together, and we hope the third is ongoing. In fact, we hope all of them are ongoing. But for phase one, she invited different artists to come in to do their own documentation. Filmmakers Giovanni Jantz, artist Yuka Murakami, architect Peter Tolkien, documentarian Anne Kaneko, Brigitte Kelly were among those who joined Susie on site. And with these stills and the short film by Yuka called Tokyo Story, we were able to see a creative interpretation of both a moment in time and the memory of things past. We were also able, through the film by Jantz, to see the layers of time like a palimpsest, because we had the film and you could see these different stages that, sort of the preparation and the customers coming in through the film, through an interview that was in 1999 and then a revisited. But then also, as the spaces emptied out, Susie went in and began to do her sound art, right? And so this story of the life of the family and the property continued on until it changed hands and incorporated ephemeral practices of documenting and drawing attention to the layers of time and spirit and animation of the land. So these are quotes from Susie, who talked about listening to the land. And here we see the sites of the property with her using instruments she made from items that were left behind around the estate sale to create sounds from the different changing dynamics of these spaces. She called the buildings amplifiers and resonators. So it's about memory and soundscape. And here you could see her in the emptied out spaces of the Tokyo Florist, such as the greenhouse, her kitchen, the workspace, where you could see her mother at right, having previously worked. And these were built into the film by Jantz. Also, the very process of Susie going through the materials and hosting an estate sale offered what she also called new lives for storied objects. As she had to empty out the house, and arguably people, her family were pack rats, and they brought everything from the 1920s structure as well as their farm out in the valley back into this house on Hyperion. And so then she had to think about what to do with them. So there were thousands of cherished items, each with a story. And as they were being tagged and sorted and sold at the estate sale, Susie led tour after tour through which each object and room was part of what she talked about, right? And as each object was sold, she wished each of them a long life and his new owner the happiness she'd experienced with it. So she's disseminated the story of the Tokyo Florist far and wide. As people visited over the course of several weekends in late November 2018, she circulated through the crowd like a hostess at her own party, microphone in hand, recording their stories of Tokio Florist and connections to the neighborhood, whether they were family friends of Sumi's from the nearby John Marshall High School or longtime customers. And I followed her and was able to incorporate some of that into the HCM application. Susie somehow managed to turn the estate sale into a commemorative act that also helped monumentalize the site, literally, as many of these neighborhoods and former neighbors and former customers later shared fond memories in support of the designation and retention of the unpermitted structures. Now, as Kristen mentioned, many people from the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, the Japanese American National Museum, and the Huntington Library came through as well. And so the papers, documents, and objects have also been disseminated to those institutions. More documentation has also continued to emerge that add to and revise our understandings of the site. For instance, a letter on the left is a commonplace letter between two girlfriends right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, talking with a really lighthearted tone, strangely, about what they were facing down. In the middle is a view, right, as they must have been viewing the property in the early 60s to move to the Hyperion site. That's Susie and her mother. At right is Dan Sakai, whose importance was drawn home to us as we read a letter submitted to the Cultural Heritage Commission by Ernest and Elaine Nagamatsu, residents of Silver Lake since 1975, who talked about how the building itself was a memorial to Dan, who was a famous dry bed car racer in the 1930s until he crashed. And so they also talked about this site as an emotional, historical talisman for the generation. Tokio Florist made us all so proud as Japanese Americans. It's been a small beam of success following the tangled, tortuous, emotional challenge following World War II. From physical and monetary huge losses, Tokio Florist, the JA Flower Market, and legions of Japanese American gardeners and growers emerged from a devastated landscape of broken dreams to make us all proud once again, end quote. So as I mentioned, we have a chance to kind of rethink and also remap. Not to remap the Tokio Florist. We're so lucky it's a monument right there in place in physical structure as a marker, but we can remap people and place across the city through these findings of additional materials and connecting them back to the property itself. And by this, what I mean is that these materials, for instance, the photo at left of the Tokio Florist delivery truck and that at right, which is of the Flower View Garden delivery truck, which was located on Los Feliz Boulevard, not so far away, offer us new ways of thinking about the property itself, those on Los Feliz, those out in the valley, and those downtown. Because what we can do when we look at them is to also think about the intersectional racial politics around each of the industries at hand. And so at right, there's likely a mixture of Latino and Japanese American field workers and delivery folks and gardens. So this suggests or highlights an example of intersectionality for sure, but also that labor, race, capitalism, and the logics of dispossession that we have to consider if we're going to consider not only preservation of neighborhoods and places, but also those critical elements of climate change and environmental justice, right? We could tell a lot of stories through this site. And it issues a reminder of the interconnectedness of all of these elements and how they are felt by communities of color in particular. And so they suggest the ways that various preservation strategies that Susie, that multiple communities, that Michael Breland and his colleague Peter and Redcar, and their involvement in this case study open up in terms of more directions going forward, perhaps speculative right now in terms of what new information we might discover with historic resources preserved, and to advance new narratives and counter narratives in productive ways. And in terms of the tears in the social fabric and gaps in generational memories, we can do some repair work here as we really demand forms of equity and memorializing the past in the truest sense of those words. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy and Kristen. I'd like to invite Michael and Peter to bring up their presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Rosalind and Kristen and Kathy and all of our team at Breland-Harper for working so hard on this project. And we definitely need to thank Redcar. They're truly an exceptional client who I think has a great amount of care in all of the projects that they undertake. As we began to explore the rich narrative and history of this site, this family, their business, and their varied pursuits, we began to understand how all of the pieces of the existing architectural fabric fit together to tell the story of a cultural landscape. We have been working with James Corner, Field Operations, to develop a landscape plan for the site. The whole team feels that the landscape design is a critical component of organizing the features of the property. Part of what we have worked on with Field Operations is an understanding of the site's organization, which divides it into 5 distinct zones that seek to maintain and restore the spatial sequence of the site and outline the overall landscape narrative. These zones reflect the functions and happenings of the site while it was in use by the Tokio Florist. The architectural fabric layered with the gardens inside of these 5 zones with their respective programs provides an understanding of the historical and cultural importance of the site. So in developing a proposed site plan for the project, we have conceived of it as a collection of structures inside and supporting a landscape. In developing a preservation approach for the structures in the site, it became clear to us there were 2 periods of significance, each needing a distinct approach. The first period from 1929, outlined in yellow, encompasses the craftsman structures, while the second period, outlined in red from 1960 to 2006, is inclusive of the structures and elements belonging to the period when the Tokio Florist was in operation on this site. A third layer, noted in blue, are the new structures we're proposing to add to the site. They bring this site into a compatible new use for the future. The first period of significance can be defined as 1929, when the Craftsman House was relocated to the site along with its 2-car garage. Both of these structures were originally constructed in 1911. There was also an incinerator added to the rear of the site in a similar time period. The proposed preservation approach for this first period significance in these 3 structures, the Craftsman House, the 2-car garage, and the incinerator, is restoration and reconstruction in the truest sense. The reconstructed garage will be converted to an office. The new compatible use, however, does require more natural light than the existing structure permits. We're proposing the addition of 2 skylights on the north face of the roof that will not be visible from the Craftsman House or the garden, and we're also proposing to add new windows into the reconstructed garage doors. This brings us to the second period of significance that we are proposing to be defined as 1960 to 2006, which is the time the family lived and operated the Tokio Florist business on the property. Over the course of this period, the family added a series of additions in structures across the site, including a pole sign in 1965, which is still standing and will be restored, in addition to the front porch of the Craftsman House that was used for retail, an extension of the pot cochere that was used as a workshop, as well as a greenhouse. The family also added several important landscape elements and gardens. My partner, Peter Harper, is going to walk you through our preservation approach for the structures inside this second period of significance.
In beginning to formulate an approach to conceptualizing and to eventually intervening upon this architectural fabric, to preserve, to interpret, and to reconstruct it, we drew from our many conversations over the past year. We found it important to incorporate a more elaborate and nuanced understanding of the significance of this property, mine from early foundational conversations with the community, the OHR, and the CHC. Foundational to many of these conversations has been the expressed desire to capture the story of Tokio Florist, the lives that built it, the community that supported it, the beauty that was created and shared there. But what we are left with are fragments of this ornate history. The people, the cut flowers, the ribbons, the baskets are all gone. Yet as we look more closely at what remains, we saw that what is left are traces of opportunities for nature to enliven and to furnish the spaces. In turn, one cannot help but to understand that the architectural fabric constructed by the family creates liminal spaces that blur the boundaries between what we might clumsily sequester as architecture or as landscape. Thus, our method for preserving this story, our reconstruction and interpretation approach, formed around the concept of the garden armature, the frame, onto which nature and art might graft themselves. This device offered us a language to preserve the organization of the place, to retain the location, massing, and form of the existing fabric, to capture the ephemeral quality of the site, and to construct what we hope is a lasting monument. We turn to several precedents that are particularly resonant for the task at hand as inspiration. Trinity Root, New York City is the 9/11 memorial, Franklin Court in Upper Right in Philadelphia, then the Noyes Museum reconstruction by Chipperfield Architects, and then lastly, Santa Maria Maggiore di Siponto by Eduardo Trisoldi in Puglia, Italy. Trisoldi's work at Santa Maria Maggiore demonstrates this concept of the frame and armature as space, as experience, as memorial. It captures the form and massing, the spatial qualities, as it unifies fragments into a more complex interpretive experience. For us, here at Tokio Florist, this approach, when coupled with materials that will weather and improve with age, attempts to capture the temporal and experiential qualities so valued by those who have visited the property. With this language at hand, we then actively explored ways to deploy it across the property, bolstered by the renewal of the beautiful gardens that support and enliven every corner of the site. Michael will now walk through each of these structures and detail their treatment.
Starting at the front of the site, the existing porch enclosure in addition is located at the front of the Craftsman House. The proposed structure maintains the same size, location, form, and roof pitch as the existing structure, but the lower portion would be reconstructed in weathered redwood where the T11 siding is, and the upper portion of the structure would be constructed out of steel. The new trellis space serves as a viewpoint for the garden, as it always has, but now inviting flowers in through its more open enclosure. We are proposing to employ the same strategy to the existing workshop that is in addition to the rear of the Craftsman Pot Cochere and also to the existing greenhouse located at the rear of the site. We felt that the existing space was not only defined by the use and structure, but also by its light quality. In thinking about interpreting these spaces into more open trellis structures, the dappled light, material palette, and joinery details became major touchstones. The proposed structures maintain the same size, location, and form as the existing structures, but the new roof structure provides an opportunity for the vines and climbers to weave into the canopies and create the dappled light quality inside of these spaces. In addition to the restoration, reconstruction, and reinterpretation of the existing structures, we're also proposing to add 2 new structures to the site. Although the site allows for the construction of just over 34,000 square feet, we're proposing an 800 square foot retail pavilion to the front of the site and a terrace office structure to the rear of the site that's approximately 7,500 square feet. Starting with the retail pavilion, pulling from an existing carport structure located in the parking lot, we began to look for architectural precedents that reinforce the lightweight and almost temporary nature of the existing structure. It was important for us to locate the new structure firmly inside of a garden that allows the landscape to create the street facade of the building, maintaining the condition that is currently in place where the first impression is one of garden and the pole sign. Part of the work in this area will be to restore the pole sign. We have the original drawings for this element that were given to us by the family. At the rear of the site, we are proposing a series of terraced offices, a jumping off point for the form of this building and the existing terraces having been used to cultivate flowers. In developing a design for a new building at the rear of the site, we also looked to Southern California modern architects like Ray Kappe and Rudolf Schindler. Their work is heavily influenced by the arts and crafts and Japanese aesthetics. This seemed particularly appropriate for this site given the history of the property and also the larger context within Los Angeles and Silver Lake. The material palette, the light quality, and massing of many of their structures reinforce much of the character defining features on this site that we wanted to make sure to include in the new space. The new structure is composed of 3 levels that are terraced and step back into the hillside. Each level will have outdoor spaces, planters, and trellises that will green the facade of the building, approximating the terrace gardens. The new structure will be built out of concrete and redwood with steel windows, pulling from the material palette of this site. The proposed building is just slightly taller than the existing Craftsman House and set back from the public right-of-way. Our hope is to maintain the feeling from the street that already exists while allowing new uses. Thank you so much for allowing us the time to walk you through all of these components. Turn it back over to you.
Thank you to our special guests for the presentations. I know that it was really difficult to get everything in such a short time, but I think you've given us a really great summary of this wonderful site and its wonderful potential for the future. So now we're going to start our Q&A portion. So if members of the audience would like to submit questions, please do so in the Q&A. I'd love to start our discussion by asking a question. So this is going to be to all of the panelists. What is your favorite part of the property and or the family's history? Any of you could go first.
I mean, I think for us, the thing for us with the family, it really centers around their resilience, but also their way of their pursuit and crafting of beauty on the property. And I think that's something that's just so apparent over time is that, they grew and adapted and changed there. And that's so beautiful. And I think about the site itself, as designers, anytime there's a property that has been outfitted and refined and intervened upon by inhabitants over time, where accumulating their aspirations, their dreams, changes in resources, the times of abundance and the lean times, and then ultimately it's all this accumulated energy and intervention that really gives architecture its life and brings it to a place that it has an energy all its own. So I think that for us was so important.
I guess I can go next. I remember the first day that I saw Tokio Florist, and I walked up the steps to the porch and had like this glimpse into the house, and I could see the gorgeous built-ins of the house that were covered by just a variety of what Kathy called cherished items, but it was portraits of family, it was Japanese cultural items, it was like other knickknacks that were just packed into their dining room and living room. And Susie answered the door and let us in. And I remember commenting on the chandelier in the dining room. And she said that because her parents and her grandmother opened the flower shop 7 days a week, almost 365 days a year, they didn't have time to go on a vacation. And so they made their home their oasis. And I think it was an oasis, not just for the family, but the entire property became this oasis for all of the customers and the people who frequented Tokio Florist. And I think that was something that was so special. So I feel, privileged that I got to see the house sort of intact. I know you saw a lot of photographs of the estate sale when everything was kind of moved and organized differently, but it was really special, I think, to see the house as it was while the family was living there.
I have so many answers that I'm not sure how to compress it all. On the one hand, I feel obligated to say something about the sign, in part because I worked on Survey LA's sign section. So I want to say that, in terms of those traces, I think it's really important that LA has persisted in landmarking the signs, what would have been advertising signs, because it's the most obvious trace of the historical past, and it allows us to enter the property and see a lot. But I have to admit that when I first thought about the question, because I've been looking again at some of the art documentation and the images, I really kept thinking about Frank with that cigar, walking around and cutting the flowers and cutting things from this area and cutting things from that area, and then bringing them into the workshop, and then Sumi and her sister Rose arranging things. And because they all did live long lives, they do, this is definitely a living and breathing part of it. And so it's like another trace that I think comes through the very shape and organization of the spaces that I think Michael and Peter really eloquently talked about, right? So I think that's another really important element to me. But honestly, you know, I think that okay, I'm gonna have to return to it because I had this one little story that now I've like left my brain. So I'll let other people.
Michael, do you wanna add what your favorite part of the property is?
I think Peter really summed it up, but I think for me, my favorite part of the property was really about sort of uncovering all of these layers of the history and the elements. I think as we all sort of started to work together, I think that was sort of the special and unique part of this project that I'm kind of carrying with me.
Great. So we have quite a few questions in the chat, and some of them are more technical in nature. So I'll try to condense some, but I think these are probably going to Michael and Peter. Well, folks wanting to know is this going to be a mixed residential and work commercial space? I think generally people are interested in who the tenants might be, what the buildings might be used for. So can you speak a bit about that?
Sure. So there isn't a planned tenant for the property yet. I think the way that we've approached the project is trying to sort of do the best thing for the site and for the buildings. And you know, I think we're hoping that there'll be a retail tenant in that front building because it seems like a nice place for sort of the neighborhood and the community to really be able to access the site and the gardens that are being planned. And then we've always imagined that the rest of the site would be probably an office use. There's no residential being planned for the site. So right now I'll be permitted as retail in the front and then office for the rest of the site, but there's no tenant in place yet.
Thank you for that. Next question is, will there be any informational plaques or signage related to the history of the property? I think that also goes to Michael and Peter.
Yes, absolutely. There will be. We haven't got into that sort of phase of development yet, but it's something I think we absolutely will be developing and hopefully working with Kristen and Kathy on and all of you as we kind of move into that next phase of development of the project. But we see it as a key component as well as art.
Great.
Oh, and you know, can I chime in one thing that, I mean, it's so great that we're able to have this conversation with Michael and Peter, because I do think there's so much potential for different ways to commemorate on-site, but also off-site, as I mentioned, with films and with the collections going to Jenham and to the Huntington and to the Natural History Museum of LA County. You know, the thing I wanted to mention before was the way in which the family, the way in which Frank and Sumi and the other members of the family became like second parents to many people in the neighborhood. We heard that repeatedly, and that was really interesting. So that the estate sale was a de facto celebration of life, and so having the cues of this is really important because they're really joyous kinds of memories. But I want to point out a couple of things. When we were doing the research, we weren't exactly sure when they reopened the florist after being incarcerated. And with the new materials that we're finding, there's more that's unfolding in terms of how they ended up. Like the timing also of being at the house, going to Hyperion is also a bit murky. Like, where did they get the money from? How did they make the, down payment? Did they pay for it up front? So a lot of that is emerging out of the new records. And it includes really some of the issues of state violence about incarceration that will definitely be a really important marker. And I think it's important because it also gives us the historical backdrop that we can understand maybe more of the recent violence against Asian American and Pacific Islander Americans, that we can see this long legacy and think of it both in terms of celebration of success, but also really marking the challenges faced. So some of the new papers that we're unpacking really have to do with the harm to the family and the real challenges when they returned and were in part disabled from being able to work because of both damages to them because of the work they were doing in Manzanar, and also how they could recoup afterwards. And so I think these are important, and it's great that the property can be a way of potentially allowing us to allude to or directly say some of this. And I think it's important to have this elsewhere as well.
Thanks for that, Kathy. I have a question, maybe Kathy or Kristen. Someone asked the family operated a farm, or asks if the family operated a farm in San Fernando Valley. Do you know the location of this farm?
It was called Roscoe then. And it's Sunland area, and it was on Helen, and we do have the address, and I have looked it up. Yeah, so we definitely need, we need to go visit. So that's another element of this remapping of, memorial spaces.
And that was sort of a clue, because as you mentioned, Kathy, we don't really know the timeline post-war of how the family, like when they returned, to LA and all that. And so we could see in directories that the family still had the flower farm in Roscoe in 1940. Was it 49? They were listed in directory. So it was these little pieces that sort of helped us to understand, okay, if that's when they, we know that they were already in Southern California by that point. So then, when did they actually, when were they able to restart the business? So.
And notably, they also, the family stories don't always match the realities.
Right.
And I think that Susie was a little surprised by some of what we found, because they also had a disabled sibling who was institutionalized. And so during wartime, this was an incredible challenge. And in the aftermath, they were in fact billed for the fact that they, this was a situation, and it sort of tells you about some of the challenges of not having your bank account be full after having been frozen and then emptied, during the war. So, again, it really interesting to think about that Roscoe location, because obviously the family didn't own the property because they were ineligible to own land out there. So it was likely a long-term lease. At least we haven't found anything different from that.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple questions, and this is going to Michael and Peter. First of all, comments. What a loving restoration. Thank you for honoring this space. Will any of the original landscaping be preserved? And then additionally, another person asks about the new structure near the street, if they want to hear more about that, and they say beautiful work, by the way.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, I wish we had another hour for field operations to do a full presentation on the landscaping, but I think yes is the sort of short answer to will some of the original landscaping be preserved? It will be. And then the hope in the plan is that the new landscaping will sort of be a California, Los Angeles, Japanese garden as it once was. So we'll have all of those elements, right, of native plants, but also of some of the species that the family had there that were unique to them. So it will be a mix of all of those things, which I think is sort of, again, that layered nature and history and storytelling that's present on the site now. For the front building, the hope is that is like a very lightweight structure. It's gonna be very small in nature. So we imagine it as right somewhere where you're picking up coffee or you're picking up something and kind of sitting inside of the garden and gathering and then going. So we really use that existing carport structure as our jumping off point for that. So we want it to read, right, really just as its column and two roof lines that will cover some of the indoor space, but also an outdoor kind of porch walkway that people will be able to sit underneath.
Great. Okay, another question is, how will the documentation art projects referred to in the first two presentations be available to the public on an ongoing way? I guess that question's for Kristen and Kathy. You may be taking your show on the road.
Well, I mean, I think because, as Kathy mentioned, the Tokio Florist and families collections have been sort of dispersed amongst several cultural institutions in Southern California. So I think there are opportunities there to do exhibitions or public programs at each of those sites. But Kathy also mentioned all these other films, short films, and some of those have been screened, in the last couple years. So there are opportunities there. But I'd love to hear some of the soundscape art pieces that Susie has made. And yeah, I think there are ways that we can somehow showcase this, either virtually or offsite in other spaces.
So the films are, we'll put the links in the chat to the films so you can see them. Brigitte Kelly has been documenting, and there'll be an outcome to that. She's been working since 2018, not yet clear what that will be. So we know that that's in process, and we know that there's additional use for some of the sound and soundscape stuff, and I think a lot of us would be interested in doing more. So we'll hope to all be in touch in some other context or way.
Great. Another question is, I guess it's a comment and a question. Tokio Florist did the flowers for my wedding and many other memorable events. So very glad to see this program. My question is, I had heard that the house had some connection in its past, the original Disney studio nearby. Do you know if that is true?
Well, it was the original location in Los Feliz was very close to the Disney studio. And so we've heard that there were some very famous clients of Tokio Florist from the nearby studios, including Disney. And so we sort of surmised that maybe the support in the 1930s really helped Tokio Florist to be so successful and be able to ride out the Depression.
The other thing that's super cool is that because Disney was across the street at what is now Gelson's and what I still call Mayfair, and when you see photos that are like aerial views, you see the property of Tokio Florist before Tokio Florist was there, and it bears much of the same footprint as you saw in the presentations today. Also, next door was an ancillary space, which is where at the corner of Griffith Park Boulevard and Hyperion, where some of the Disney animators were located. And then when there was some other work plan or transitional plan, an illustrator, animator actually lived, I think Susie said lived with them or else visited with them because she was a kid and he did some pictures of her also. So yeah, there's a Disney connection.
Okay, next question. Given its listing as an historic cultural monument, folks may be interested in visiting on site. Could the public visit or engage with the site given the extensive research and work regarding its historic and cultural significance? And this person also asked if any of the artifacts are going to be displayed in museums or other exhibitions. Maybe any of you can answer that question.
I guess I'll just talk about my hope because, it's really up to Redcar, but I'd love to see some kind of public art installation, in addition to, I think, the ways that Michael and Peter are, trying to pay homage to Tokio Florist and the family. I mean, I think it'd be great to have some other visual cue, I think that represented the layered history of that site. We also talked about some kind of didactic panel or something that's more closer to the sidewalk, or something that might give more of the history of the site. So I think there are different, ways that we sort of see this happening. Yeah, I think, at JANM and some of the other institutions, I think there definitely are opportunities to either have small exhibitions or to make the collections available online. So I hope that happens in the future as well.
And Michael and Peter, the front building is intended, if things go as the way you're thinking, for people as customers to visit, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, what we're working on right now is really that front building and that front garden, I think will really be open to the public. And we are planning to have some public art there, talking to several different local artists about possibilities for art pieces kind of inside of that space and inside of that garden. So while I think maybe, from the parking lot back really will be more of the space of whoever ends up, occupying those buildings, I do think the front of the site will feel much more open to the public and be a space that people are interacting with and kind of have a way to engage with this history over time.
Someone asks a question about the house. The house, well, comment and question, the house is so beautiful. Do you know anything of the history of the house? And I'm happy to chime in here for a bit. I also co-authored the nomination with colleagues Kristen and Catherine, and I did uncover some research about the house. The house, we believe, was built in 1911 by the Althouse brothers. They were held a real estate company that was established in around 1900, and they specialized in the construction of high-end homes. It was actually built in another part of Los Angeles, where now presently Koreatown, and it was moved to the current location in 1929 by then owner Dr. Harry Brigham, who was, I can't remember, was he a homeopathic doctor? Osteopathic doctor, okay. And I believe we uncovered that they built the house for, the cost was $9,850. So that's a little bit about the house. Maybe Kathy could add.
I can't remember the name of that original, the person who originally commissioned the architect to do it, but it turns out he was actually started out as an agriculturalist. He was an orchardist. He had citrus groves, and then he had a ranch, and it spanned California and also Mexico, which is interesting because Flower View Gardens, the Japanese, the Ito, just other folks related to the Ito family similarly had a kind of Japanese California. Anyway, I'm finding all kinds of connections that I think is just cool conceptually, even if it's not chronologically related to Hyperion.
Well, folks, it's 1 o'clock. We've reached our magic hour. I see there's a couple questions in the chat that we didn't get to, and we're happy to follow up with you. Just a quick one. Was when do you think the restoration and new construction will be completed? I think people probably are eager to know that one, and then we'll wrap up.
So I think we're eager to know that as well. We are about to sort of start the permitting process in earnest with plans going into the city. So I don't think there will be any construction, kind of on the site for maybe the next 8+ months. So I think Rosalind and Kristen and Kathy will sort of be in the loop right on all of those milestones, so everybody can kind of, stay abreast of what's going on the site as we progress through all the development.
Great. Well, I just want to thank our special guests for taking the time to join me and the Conservancy in this program. We're very grateful. Also to our audience who's joined us today. Have a great rest of the day.